Hi everyone. So today we are going to be studying the first chapter in IGCSE biology and even in O levels, which is characteristics and classification of living organisms. These are basically the features that all of the living organisms share, whether they are plants, animals, fungi, or bacteria. So let's exactly see what are the characteristics of living organisms, right? And we say, all right, so this chapter is divided into three subpoints. The first one is the characteristics of living organisms, which we are going to be discussing in this chapter, in this video. All right, and in the following videos, we're going to cover classification systems and the features of organisms. I hope you enjoy, and let's get started. All right. So, biologists they have agreed that all the living organisms they show these seven basic characteristics. And these characteristics include number 1 movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion and nutrition. Now, why do we need to learn these characteristics? Because these characteristics actually help us in three main things. The first one is they identify between living and non-living, so that scientists can easily classify, between, any species that they found, whether it's living or it's non-living. All right. Number second is to understand how the organisms survive, and obviously to identify the living things. So let's go one by one over them. All right. So the first one that we are going to start off is movement. Now, this is the definition that the examiner requires you to write in your exam. So remember to always write this definition. It's a very high scoring definition. So so what is exactly movement? So movement is described as an action by an organism or part of an organism that is causing the change of position or place, right? So movement is it's very important to note over here that movement does not always mean that you're moving from one place to another. For example, it's very obvious in human beings, especially in animals, they show a very obvious movement like walking, flying, and swimming. But in the case of plants, they do not show much of an obvious movement. For example, but it doesn't mean that they do not move. They show movement, but it is usually very slow or subtle. Now you might ask, what type of movement? Well, for example, if we see a sunflower that is bending towards light, so that is what we basically call movement in plants. Similarly, the roots that are growing downwards into the soil, so that is what we refer to movement in plants. Sorry. Again, movement can also occur inside the organisms. Well, if you see a cell, we are going to study chapter number 2, which is the cell, in much more detail, but just to give you a brief idea, that when we have a cell, we have a jelly like substance inside them that is called as cytoplasm. And that cytoplasm, when it moves, that cytoplasm moving inside a cell is actually the what we refer to the movement inside the organisms. All right. Now, an exam tip that I would like to give you is that again, whenever they ask you, do plants move? Yes, plants definitely move, but not just from like place to place like animals, and we do. All right. All right, now let's move ahead towards the second characteristic, which is respiration. Now, let's go over the definition first. So, what is respiration? This is the same definition that you're going to write in your exam again. So, it is described, and I want you to learn all of these definitions, right? All right, because they usually examiners they like to ask about these definitions. All right, the next one is respiration. So it is described as the chemical reactions in cells. All right, so it basically takes place inside a cell, and that breaks down. Now, what happens in that chemical reaction? It breaks down your nutrient molecules, and it releases energy for metabolism. Now, why do we need this energy? We need energy to drive metabolism, and that energy is used in certain things. Now, that energy is used for us. Now, why every living organism? It needs energy, obviously, to move, to grow, to repair their cells, and to maintain body processes. And all of this energy is actually coming from respiration, right? Now, let me give you some examples of respiration. For example, humans, they respire using glucose and oxygen. Again, this is a separate chapter. We are going to learn about this in much more detail. Just want to give you a brief idea about what exactly is respiration. So, till now, you understand that respiration is a chemical reaction and it takes place in cells that is breaking down your nutrient molecules, meaning the food that you take, obviously, that goes inside your cell as nutrient molecule. So, we're breaking that down to release energy for us to move to do work, right? That is what is mainly respiration. Now, you might be wondering why have I added this picture of breathing over here? Because I've seen a lot of students mixing respiration with breathing. Breathing is something different. Breathing is not respiration. Note that. It's very important because breathing is actually the taking in and out of air via lungs or gills, right? And respiration is actually a chemical reaction that is taking place inside your cells, all right? So do not mix up respiration with breathing, all right? All right. Now, let's talk about sensitivity. So, what is sensitivity? The basic definition, it is the ability to detect and respond to changes in the internal or the external environment. Now, these changes in the internal or the external environment, we call this as stimuli, all right? And certain examples of stimuli is, let's suppose, temperature. So temperature is a stimuli, okay? So stimuli, they can be different. It can be light, it can be temperature, it can be sound, touch, or any chemical. So basically, any change that is happening in your internal or your external environment. Now, all of these stimuli, they're obviously external stimuli that I've listed over here, but chemical is an internal stimuli. All right, even chemical can be an internal or an external, both. So you guys can see over here that there's a girl, and this pan, we assume that it is very hot. All right, so as soon as this girl, it is going to touch, let's suppose it accidentally somehow touches this pan, this pot, and she quickly pulled her hand away from this pot. So what was this actually? Your body first detected that this pan, this pot over here is hot. And in response to this, in response to this touching of this hot object, it quickly pulled its hand away from, from this hot object. That was basically your body's response. All right. Now, um, another example over here, that plants, how do plants show sensitivity? All right. So as you can see over here, this is a palm tree. And over here, you can see that this is the sun and it is bending towards sunlight. So this is obviously an example of sensitivity. Why? Because you see, sun is this sun over here, the bright light of sun. This is actually the stimuli for this plant, and obviously plants want, and it is growing towards sunlight, which shows that it is aligning its growth. It wants its growth to be maximum by facing towards sunlight, right? So that it can have maximum energy for photosynthesis and all of this. So again, this is also an example of sensitivity. Another example that you can, to understand sensitivity better, would be, let's suppose, when you walk into a room that is very bright. So how does your eyes respond to it, or how does your body respond to it? Well, the pupils of your eye, they become smaller in bright light. So that is your response to the stimuli, which was bright light. All right. Now, again, this is another example, the leaves of the touch me not plant closing when touched. I hope you guys have seen that plant when you touch it and it, instantly closes its leaves. So that is also an example of stimuli, right? Sorry, that is an example of sensitivity. All right. So what sensitivity basically, helps human? What? Why? The question is that why do organisms, they need sensitivity? Well, sensitivity, we say that it helps the organisms to survive by responding appropriately to their surroundings, because this is very important. When any organism is outside, it can have a lot of dangers outside, so it needs to survive appropriately by identifying its stimuli and then responding it so that it can survive in that environment and it can protect itself. All right, I hope you guys understand what sensitivity is. Moving ahead. The next one is growth. So, the basic definition that it is the permanent increase in size and dry mass. Now, two very, very important words to note over here: permanent, all right, and the other one is dry mass. Now, growth occurs due to the cell division and cell enlargement, and again, it is permanent, it is something that cannot be reversed, all right. So growth cannot be reversed. So anything that is reversible, I'm not going to count this as growth. For example, we say that when you eat food, your weight increases temporarily, but that is not growth, okay? Why is it not growth? Because obviously you can lose weight. So we're talking about the dry mass over here. You can lose weight, all right? So growth happens mainly because of three things: when cells divide, when cells increase in size, and when new tissues are formed. So that is what I'm going to call as growth. Again, two important key points to note over here: that growth, it involves an increase in dry mass and not the water content. All right. And then the temporary weight gain is not for growth. So that is what I was actually talking about. Now, let me give you some examples of growth. As you can see, over here, a seed that is growing into a plant and then ultimately into a beautiful tree over here. So that is what we call basically growth. So obviously this tree cannot go back into a seed, right? That's irreversible. So that is what I'm going to call as growth. Again, a baby that's growing into an adult, that is again an example of growth. And then increase in length of roots and stems. So that is everything that I'm going to refer to as growth. So again, growth is irreversible. Anything that can go back, I'm not going to say that it is growth. All right? It has to be permanent, and it has to be a permanent increase in your size and in your dry mass. Perfect. Let's move ahead. Now, next is reproduction. The basic definition, it is described as the processes that makes more of the same kind of organism. Now, reproduction is the process that makes more of the same kind of an organism. Remember, it does not mean that it is growth or repair, all right? Reproduction is not growth. Do not confuse reproduction with growth, because growth is all about producing new individuals, all right? For example, this baby elephant over here, it has reproduced, right? Similarly, plants that are producing seeds. So that is what we call reproduction. And even over here, you can see this cute little bacteria that is dividing. And this is what I'm going to call reproduction. So as you can see, from one bacteria, look how many more bacteria have formed. And that is through a process through a process called as reproduction. So this is, again, reproduction. An important point that I would like to give you here is that, again, reproduction can be sexual or it can be asexual, right? So again, it produces new individuals. Now, an important point that I was about to give you was that an individual organism, it does not need to reproduce to stay alive. All right? So it's not a characteristic that is needed to stay alive. Rather, it's a characteristic that is essential for the continuation of the species. So that is why any living organism would have the property of reproduction so that it can produce, that it can make more of the same kind of an organism. I hope it's clear. So let's go towards the sixth characteristic. All right, this is my favorite. It is called as excretion, and excretion is actually another big chapter in your syllabus, which we are going to go in a lot more detail than this. But right here, I just want you to understand the basic definition of what excretion is. All right, so it is the removal of the waste products of metabolism and substances that are in excess of requirement. Remember, it is the removal of the waste products of metabolism. All right, and these waste products are very, very harmful if they, build up in our body. So we need to remove these waste products. And common examples of these waste products would include carbon dioxide that is removed during breathing. So remember, carbon dioxide, it is a metabolic waste product. Number second, urea. Urea is found in urine, and we also excrete this from our body because it is toxic to our body. And then, of course, plants, they release oxygen. Now, you may say that, okay, oxygen is not a waste product. Obviously, we inhale oxygen during breathing. We need oxygen to survive. But for plants, this acts as a waste product of photosynthesis. All right, so it's a waste product for plants when they do photosynthesis. So they have to release this out. And similarly, you guys can see this cute image of a kid over here, and it shows it that it is sweating right now. Why have I added this pic over here? Because again, sweating is also excretion. Now, how is sweating excretion? Because in this process, in when you are sweating, you're basically excreting out all your excess salts, your water. So all of these are also the metabolic waste products, right? So sweating is actually also a form of excretion in our body. Now, one thing that I have seen students do is that they confuse excretion with egestion. All right, very, very important to note over here that excretion is not the same as egestion or digestion. Because what egestion or digestion is, that it is the removal of the undigested food and not the removal of metabolic waste. All right. So remember, this is an exam tip. Do not confuse excretion with egestion. Egestion or digestion, it is the removal of undigested food. All right. Whereas excretion, it is the removal of the metabolic waste product and substances that are in excess of requirement. What substances? For example, excess water, excess salts. All of these are substances that are in excess of requirement, and this is what they're basically excreted out during sweating. All right, in sweating, when you are breathing out carbon dioxide, and all of these examples that I've given over here. All right, I hope excretion is clear. Now we are going to move towards nutrition finally, the last one. All right. So, what is nutrition? It is described as the taking in of materials for energy, growth, and development. Obviously, we take food, we eat food. As you can see, this guy is eating a lot of, I guess, some healthy food over here. But yeah. All right. So, um, let's just not distract ourselves. All right. So, all organisms actually need nutrients. Now, why do we need to eat food? Because we need food so that we can have energy, we can build up some cells, we can grow, we can repair. So for all of these processes, we need to take in food. So we need to take in materials. And what are the different types of nutrition? For example, humans, when we eat out, so we are basically known as heterotrophic. What are heterotrophic? When animals or human beings, we obtain food from other organisms, right? See, we are not making our own food. We're eating, we are consuming food from other organisms, all right? And what about plants? Plants, they do not consume food from other organisms. What they do is they can make their own food. So anything that can make their own food, we call it as autotrophic. All right. And anything that obtains food from other organisms, we're going to call this as heterotrophic. Simple, right? All right. So again, when we're not going to eat food, we're not going to have any energy, we're not going to grow, and obviously then there's no survival, right? So again, an exam tip: without nutrition, you and I, none of us can survive. Obviously, organisms, they cannot survive. So these are certain examples. When humans, again, this is an example given over here, we eat carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, to ensure our nutrition. And then plants, they make glucose. So what type of food do plants make? They make glucose by which process? By the process of photosynthesis. All right, so photosynthesis is a process that actually makes glucose for plants, and this is the food that plants, consume. Then another example would be fungi. So fungi that is absorbing nutrients from decaying matter. A mnemonic that you can learn to remember all of these seven characteristics would be Mrs. Gren. M for movement, R for respiration, S for sensitivity, G for growth, R for reproduction, E for excretion, and N for nutrition. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and you know like this video, and stay tuned for the upcoming videos because we are going to talk a lot about biology. All right. Thank you. Bye bye.